example, China did not rapidly increase their money supply, but they still have commodity shortages because if, say, Americans print a ton of money and buy a ton of commodities, commodities are a global market. And so that can cause these global inflationary pressures. You don't just get localized inflation. Usually it kind of spreads around the world. And sharply rising food and energy prices are a big risk for social unrest in many countries, and are likely to cause political regime changes. And so that's something we're facing in the United States. It's something you're facing in the UK. It's something obviously you're facing in many emerging markets. It's a really challenging thing for a lot of them to deal with. And in Europe, I think part of the reason was they've cut off some of their most reliable baseload power. So they've made themselves even more reliant on natural gas, and then you have a shortage.
Germany and nuclear. The nuclear situation in Germany is ridiculous.
Yeah, it's basically like solar and wind is useful as a percentage of the grid, but if you have that as too high of an allocation, you can get these shortages if you don't plan for it, if you don't have the storage for it, if you don't have these other these energy markets in place to kind of arbitrage those differences. You need reliable baseload power. And ironically, basically with Germany shutting off nuclear, they made themselves more reliant on coal. They could have instead winded down coal, but instead they wound down nuclear. And you have basically just any market that kind of goes after its baseload power and becomes more reliant on imported power or on variable power sources puts themselves at risk for this. As we come out of COVID, that can exacerbate some of these commodity shortages, right?
Yeah.
So over the past decade, commodities go in these big 10, 15-year capex cycles where they're oversupplied, and so they're super cheap and nobody wants to put new capital, develop new mines, new production. Then eventually, demand keeps going up, supply eventually dwindles. We start to get tighter markets and we get this price spike. And a lot of policies and expectations have recency bias built into them. So they assume that whatever's happening now and over the past 5 to 10 years is that way forever. So whenever we have these cheap commodity environments, oversupply, people kind of think we've reached the end of commodity scarcity. We've kind of solved our scarcity. We have limitless abundance. We have no inflationary pressures. But inevitably, when that tighter commodity cycle comes, less capex goes into developing new sources. You get that increase in price. And so the past 5 years, we've been in this commodity oversupply environment, and going forward, commodity markets look a lot tighter. And so you can have years where they go down, right? It's not like a straight line. You can have these, economic decelerations and accelerations, but in general, we're in a tighter market for supply of energy and other commodities. And, basically politicians are going to find themselves in a tough position where if they want to fight that inflation, they have to pull back on things that stimulate demand. But then you can get, slower growing or outright recessionary economies, which people don't like. Or they can keep their foot on the gas and keep that demand high, but then they have high inflation. And so you see issues where, for example, people have those energy bills skyrocketing. So some countries, they give people money to, energy stimulus to basically help people pay, which makes sense because people are literally getting their budget gets squeezed, so the government comes in and helps them. But that basically also keeps demand high and is kind of part of this inflationary cycle. And so, it's kind of like grass is always greener, right? So if they don't stimulate, people are going to be like, oh, the economy's sluggish, the government should do something. And if they do stimulate, people are going to say, well, where's all this inflation coming from? This inflation is too high. And a lot of it's partially tied to the money supply, and it's also the commodity resource cycle we're going through, as well as political decisions around the quality of energy. So basically, if a country imports more than it exports, then it's running a trade deficit. And so, you can use an example of, say, two neighbors, right? So if there's two neighbors and, one of them is, say, elderly and the other one does a bunch of services for them, right? So they mow their lawn, they clean their pool, they help them out. So they're basically having a services surplus. So that trade is both goods, physical goods, and services. Could be software, could be finance, different services. And so in that case of those two neighbors, the younger neighbor is helping out the older neighbor in exchange for some sort of payment, right? And so they can say take those dollars, and let's say they buy part of their land. So the younger neighbor expands his land into that other person's property because they're basically getting a surplus. Then they go ahead and they buy their shed, they buy their pool, and it's kind of like over time that second home is kind of encroaching on the other home because the first home is selling away part of its assets in order to pay for that consumption. And that's generally what happens when you run a trade deficit. So if a country runs a consistent trade deficit, let's say the United States runs a trade deficit, which is what we're doing ever since we introduced the petrodollar system. So foreigners are in aggregate collecting dollar surpluses. So China, Germany, Japan, Singapore, Switzerland, Taiwan, these countries are running these structural trade surpluses. They're getting all these excess dollars, and then they take those dollars and they buy U.S. assets with them. So they could buy U.S. treasuries, like paper liabilities for them that are assets, or they can go and buy hard assets. They can buy our land, they can buy our real estate, they can buy our shares of corporations. So they own a bigger percentage of Apple, they own a bigger percentage of our land, they own a bigger percentage of our single-family homes. And so, for example, decades ago, foreigners owned maybe 3 or 4% of our U.S. equity market, but now they own 20 or 25%, depending on how you measure it, of our U.S. equity market. So basically, we are running a deficit in terms of we're buying more depreciating consumer assets from the rest of the world, and in exchange, they're taking those dollars and they're buying our permanent appreciating assets. Basically, they're taking all these surplus dollars. Also, the UK usually runs a trade deficit as well, so they're taking their pounds, and then they cycle those back into those countries, and so they end up owning a larger percentage of those kind of desirable financial assets, due to the fact that they're running these manufacturing surpluses and that they're selling more to the UK and more to the United States than we are selling to them. Interest rates are important, as well as capital flows. And then it's more complicated because countries then have liabilities denominated in other currencies as well, and so you can get these weird let's say Brazil, for example. So Brazil has a lot of dollar denominated debt, right? So they owe dollars, and what's unintuitive is the fact that they don't necessarily even owe those dollars to Americans. They can owe those dollars to European lenders. They can owe those dollars to Chinese lenders, Japanese lenders, right? So in fact, most of it is not owed to the U.S. So they owe dollars to someone in the world. And if the dollar strengthens, basically imagine like you take out a mortgage in Swiss francs, right? And the Swiss franc goes
leverage.
up.
It's basically leverage.
It's leverage in a currency they don't control. And so, for example, if you mortgage your house in Swiss franc, so your cash flows are in dollars or pounds, and your liabilities are in franc. And if the franc goes up relative to dollars or pounds, your debts just increased relative to your asset values and your incomes. That's a problem. And so Brazil, if they have all these dollar-based debts and the dollar strengthens relative to other currencies, especially the Brazilian real, they basically get quantitative tightening. They're basically being squeezed. Their liabilities are increasing in value compared to their income compared to their asset values. And so that can be very problematic for them. And so that's why emerging markets go through these huge boom bust cycles, because so many of them have these dollar dominated debts. And so they get squeezed by what happens to the dollar, which they have nothing to do with. And so it's really funny. So for example, let's say Chinese, they have all these dollar surpluses. If they decide to put all that capital in the US, that's going to prop up the value of the dollar, and that's going to squeeze Brazil, right? So you have these weird dynamics that happen around the world. If all this capital shoves into the dollar, if everybody wants to buy the NASDAQ, that actually hurts Brazil. But then if, say, people pull out of the NASDAQ and the dollar weakens, Brazil gets a reprieve from their liabilities decrease in value, or they ease up a little bit, and that allows Brazil to have some breathing room in terms of expansion. And so part of the downside of having one country's currency as kind of this, the asset that we use for both, central bank reserve assets as the treasury, and as, the big liability around the world that all these countries have, is that as that currency attracts or loses capital, it causes these booms and busts in these emerging markets. And it's just a really improperly designed
Before
system.
we continue, help us clicking that YouTube like button and subscribe now to our channel. This shows the algorithm that you valued this information, and it helps us spread that message. Sharing is caring. And now, let's continue.
Do you want to know one thing about crypto? I made over 3,000% in profit in a few weeks. Fact is, the traditional financial system, the traditional money system makes you poor, not rich. If you want to earn $500,000, $1 million, you have to wait until you're 50, 60, 70 in the traditional financial system, and you probably will still be broke. and you will be old. This is not a sexy combination, as you can imagine. But the question is, how can you start in crypto and make these profits? Where to invest? Where to start? My name is Gunnar and I'm from Germany, as you can hear, and things are a little bit different in Germany. More about that later on. Fact is, there are lots of different cryptocurrencies. It's a gigantic universe where beginners and professionals get easily lost. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. There are 7 key steps you need to follow to become successful in this market. You have to know them, and if you fail one of them, it's literally impossible to succeed in this market. Just an example, one of the key points is your exchange, and one of the biggest are, for example, Binance and Coinbase. These are trusted and well-established exchanges, but, and this is a big but, you won't find the super profitable coins on those exchanges. The unknown super profitable coins that get gigantic profits are not traded on those kind of exchanges. They are traded on much smaller insider platforms that are barely known. And I can tell you what those super secret exchanges are and why they are so profitable. And another super important thing are the right information sources. The point is, the internet is gigantic. There are hundreds and hundreds of YouTube channels, blogs, pages, and much more. And there are also market makers and influencers. For example, Elon Musk, he is not a crypto guy, but the moment he recommended Dogecoin, it went through the roof, to the moon, so to say. But why did he recommend it? Where did he hear it from? He didn't hear it from newspapers. And believe me, he is listening to someone. But you have to know who, and you have to react before he is reacting. This is really important. And these are only 2 of the 7 steps you have to follow in order to be successful in crypto. And if you want to know all of these steps in much more detail, and if you want to have a comprehensive checklist, here's what you should do. There is a link below this video. Click on this link and you will get the opportunity to subscribe to my channel. Click on the link and you will see a video where I explain the next steps. So see you soon. Click on the link now. I'll see you there.